All right. So, welcome everybody to our Kinesio Geek Book Club. We actually do this the first Monday of every month, and it's not like a normal book club in that we don't usually assign reading. Normally, the group just comes together and everyone kind of shares whatever resources that they're excited about right now. So, what we're reading and what we're listening to, and even what we're watching on YouTube. And it's super fun to talk with other kinesiology practitioners. But a little while ago, Hugo Tobar put out a book. Now, he's put out another one since we had first talked about doing this, but he put out this book, The Four Stages of Stress. And when I saw it, I thought it would be really interesting for us to have a bit of a conversation about it. And anybody who has been reading it and has some questions could join us and could talk about it as well. And we could get some background information and some insight from the author himself. So thank you for joining us. And Hugo, I would love to start just by actually, I'll just say to everybody, I was just going to ask a few questions and we'll have just a little conversation and then we'll open it up. And whatever questions you have, we'll go ahead and answer those too. Um, but I would love to start just by asking you, who is this book for? Because when I saw that it was available on Amazon, I thought, oh, this is going to be like an introduction to the public. But the languaging and stuff is not introductory to the public. So, who is your intended market here?
I didn't actually have an intended market. I mean, as the process of writing the textbook, um, and I've always been describing in my classes the neurology of muscle testing and why, and how with a connection to the PAG and everything, how the muscle testing is just neurology because there's a lot of people out there that say it's pseudoscience, and even in the textbook I've got an appendix: muscle testing, pseudoscience, or a stress management system. And when I go and it's got a much more elaborate sort of description or easier to understand description of that. But in the process of that, I sat down and I wanted to do a review of stress, and using AI now, I said, okay, let's do a little review. And it brought up these things like allostasis and interoception, which I wasn't really aware of. And so I started getting into that. And especially interoception started getting very big. And at one point I looked at it and I think, you know what I've probably become more than anything is just an expert in stress. And so I thought, you know what, I should actually write a book on stress, but I want to make it very technical and almost an academic style, because I want it to be a thesis on, if you like, on stress, and also leading into the neurology of muscle testing, which is kind of towards the back of the book. And even when I thought, well, like 25 years ago, I went to a human brain mapping conference, and there was this Chinese guy there. He had this study where he needled, I think it was large intestine 4 or 5. It's the point they use for pain, analgesia. And he needled it, and then he needled right next to it and subtracted one brain scan from the other. And he had the whole PAG lit up where you've got the endogenous opioid analgesic system. And I was just like, oh my God, that is a proof that of acupuncture works. So I started looking into that. And I was kind of shocked to find that they actually proved it was actually a neurological mechanism and not a chi mechanism, or vitalism as they call it. And so this book is really an academic kind of style of writing, saying, well, this is my idea of stress. I always said, well, Saley had his 3 stages of stress and I added 0. But if you look at the different models of stress, even like Porges and his polyvagal theory and other things, most of them were missing bits. None of them were actually complete. And so in the process of writing it, it just grew and grew. And then I did a chapter on all of the stages. And then I had this bright idea at one point to include attachment styles. I think I was inspired by both Daria and Kendall talking about it at the conferences. and that was kind of interesting because and so that's how I wrote it. So I didn't particularly write it for anyone, but I wanted it to be like standalone, and no one, if some dickhead wants to say, oh, what you do is pseudoscience, just direct them to this, because muscle testing is neurology, and even acupuncture is neurology. And what I found is, and another thing, I've got the neuroemotional pathways, which is kind of based on SIPs, and which are both SIPs and other acupressure techniques are very powerful as powers of stress systems. And so if acupuncture is a neurological mechanism, that means, well, I sort of brought in a new name. I call it neuropressure, where you're just saying, okay, we're doing acupressure, but it's a neurological mechanism. It's not a chi or vitalistic mechanism. And because, back in the day, one of my students in Germany, she was this French psychologist, and she had a heart rate variability machine, and she was really frustrated. She came to me one day in Ketzarten and said, I've done all this training and blah, blah, blah. And the only technique that makes a change on HRV is the NEPs. And I was like, what? And because that's actually what it's designed for. And then I said that to Alexandra, my ex-wife, and her colleague Eva bought one, and then I bought one. And then so I did one. I did one. It's actually on Alfred, actually. And it's one of the appendixes in the textbook is on that. And they so that's, like being able to show a change in heart rate variability and saying here's a clear mechanism that acupressure, or let's call it neuropressure, because it's a neurological mechanism, and muscle testing is neurology. And even the 4 states of a muscle test, Richard Utt called them 7, but I called it 4 because over facilitated and under inhibited gives you the same observable response. But he liked his 7s and his holograms, but I called it the 4 observable responses of an indicator muscle, which is just a modification of what Richard Utt said. And then as I was doing it, I was actually able to map the 3 stages of 1, 2, and 3 to actually different PAG columns, which was kind of incredible because it's the PAG that can transmit stress into your muscles. So if you do an indicator muscle test properly, and any form of kinesiology does indicator muscle testing, it's not specific to any type of kinesiology. If you're trained properly on how to use an indicator muscle, it's actually, when you introduce a stressor into the system, the only possible thing that can change is in the PAG, and that's neurology. That is known. That's PENSET, So that's why I wrote it, to answer that question.
Okay. So in that, you've kind of touched on all of the things actually that I wanted to ask you about. So maybe we'll just go into a couple of them in a little more detail.
Sure.
Maybe starting with the idea of the acupressure points, because that's something you had just mentioned. I'm curious, it's one of the last things you talk about in the book, but what would a shift to neuropressure points rather than acupressure points mean to our fields?
Nothing. It's just a different name. It's just saying, I'm just saying it's like, we even coined this term, and this is with Daria, because Daria was consulting with me a bit on this. And she said, oh, let's coin this term neurokinesiology, where we're just saying that the muscle test is a neurological mechanism and there's no vitalistic component to it. And so it was just sort of to differentiate it a bit, because there's a lot of, with this whole thing that kinesiology attracts a lot of issues with being called a pseudoscience. So I just thought, oh, I'll just change the name.
Okay, so maybe I misunderstood, because it felt like what you were saying in that, and you can clarify it for me, is that we're not really looking at things like elements and meridians and such. We're really looking at the individual points and that the points have an effect in the brain, but it's not because it's part of the kidney meridian or something of that sort. Is that right?
No, well, this is the thing, right? I still think what I think is, in Chinese medicine, you've got the law of five elements, you've got all this, and we use that, and we use tonification and sedation points and things like this. The techniques work. There's no question. They've been working for 3,000 years. It's just the explanation changes. And this has happened many times before where there's been some vitalistic explanation because people can't explain it. So what I'm saying is that the techniques work. Look, law of five elements is still the law of five elements. It's been shown to work, and you might use acupressure. I remember doing 5-element acupressure with Charles. He taught it when I was in the college. And that came from Richard Utt. He had his way of doing it. I've got my own book, Balancing with the Five Elements. I have a different version of it, my own ideas on it. And, so what I'm saying is the techniques still, I'm not denying any of the techniques. We know they work. We've been using them for so long. And kinesiology has been getting so many good results. And even in there, we talk about, there's a doctrine in medicine that you can say, well, a technique works, but we can't explain it. Then it's still a valid technique. We just don't know how to explain it. And we might have some vitalistic notion of that. Unfortunately, there's people out there, for example, they might use muscle testing as a diagnostic thing where they're, I remember when I was a student, for example, there was a newspaper article someone pinned in the college, and they said this woman died of cancer because her kinesiologist muscle tested they were cured and they needed to stop their treatments, and then of course they died, and that was from a muscle test, and so this is the thing. That's the problem with that. Yeah.
Like all science is magic until we understand it, and then it's science, right?
Yeah.
Okay, understood. So let's go back a little bit here then. This framework where we're actually looking at columnar depth within the peg as sort of a defining mechanism for everything that's going on in the body. What are the implications of that for practitioners? Like, why should everybody learn about this framework, in your opinion?
Well, see, the thing is, I'm not sure about, because I know I learnt kinesiology with Charles and Richard Utt, were my two probably. Charles, obviously, my most influential teacher, but I did do some training with Richard, and I did a lot of AP with Charles. So they were the AP and the LEAP. And so we use this idea of powers of stress, and that's in the SIPs. Ian came from the same, he was before me even, and his ideas of powers of stress, Richard had a physical method where he'd keep pause locking the sedate of an indicator muscle until it went down. And that's where he got the idea of powers of stress, the name. And then Ian came along and said, hey, let's use acupoints. And that was brilliant. That changed everything. And then people had other things and using different points here, the heart self points from Susan Probert and all this kind of thing. So the thing is what the PAG, so then what you're looking at is when you test a muscle, it can either be there's no change, there's the unlock that you can tonify, which what I did was I related them to the 3 stages of stress. I said, well, that's first stage of stress. Then there's over facilitation, second stage of stress, and then under facilitation where you can't tonify it is the 3rd stage of stress. And so they're and then there's no, so they're the 4 observable responses of an indicator muscle, correct? And so with that, and what's kind of interesting, what I found doing that, like in the traditional trauma therapies, they go, fight flight, which is the first stage of stress, which we observe with the indicator changer, we can tonify, and then they go freeze, which is actually the 3rd stage of stress, which I prefer to call it defeat, because it's belly up basically, but they call it freeze, fine. And they know that's the ventrolateral pag, and they know that the fight was the dorsomedial pag and the flight was the dorsolateral pag. But no one had really looked at the lateral pag, like they're the four pag columns. And so when I was doing it and I put it into the eye, I said, hang on, what's with the lateral pag? Could that actually relate to the overfacilitation? And it went off and it came back and it says, yes, here are the papers that say that because because in the second stage of stress, and this is what Porges misses, because he's got myelinated vagus, which is the 0 stage. He's got the alarm stage, which is sympathetic, and then he's got what he calls as the freeze, which is the unmyelinated vagus, which is the 3rd stage of stress. But there's actually in second stage of stress, we've always, like Saley said, it was the high levels of cortisol. But you've also, with that, what I found by doing that, you've also got chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So not only have you got high levels of cortisol, you've actually got high levels of adrenaline, noradrenaline. And this actually relates to the lateral pag. It's just no one in the trauma stress world in the official medicals has actually related it to that. And so that would be one thing they would find controversial in that. So why that's important for a kinesiologist to know that is it helps you understand that when you're muscle testing, you're actually talking to a different part of the pag, which is each one receives different inputs from other areas. So the stressor, whatever, and when you're doing a balance, like you work with SIPs a lot, so when you're doing a balance with lots of powers of stress, each stage you can get different responses. You might get no response, you might get under facilitation, I can't tonify it, you might get over facilitation. And so in those two cases, you would use SIPs to bring it back, to de-stress. And that's why it's important to understand that, is that because that means your muscle test responses are founded in neurology.
And I really loved that last section of the book where you really do get into this being an explanation for how muscle testing actually works, because it is maybe the most satisfying explanation I have seen so far of it, which is pretty great.
Well, what it also means now, if anyone criticises, it's only $40 on Amazon, you can say, and it's now on Kindle. I just did the Kindle version. And so you can say, if anyone doubts you, just read this book, If you're some scientist and neurology, read that book and then come and talk to me, Because it's pretty hard to argue with anything in it,
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'll just ask one more question and then we'll see what other questions people have for you. You had mentioned earlier about bringing in the attachment styles, which was also something that I thought was really interesting in this, because people talk about attachment styles like that's an intrinsic part of your personality, right? Like that's just the way that this person is. But then in reading this, it really feels like that's a defense mechanism. That's part of a stress response. So maybe if the stress was balanced, the person is able to attach in a different way. Is that something that you've been kind of playing with, or?
Yeah, looking back, it's something I could have done more with, because I think it's only in the 0 stage, and I probably could have done more with that. But it's also part of developmental, because normally it's about when trauma comes in, and it's kind of how and then different levels of trauma at different developmental stages. I don't know if you've seen Daria's work with the psycho-emotional trauma. She's actually expanded that, and then she wrote a book. I've been helping her with it. And I looked at the book and she kind of buried her model. And when I put that chapter into the AI, it popped it right out of my face and started going apeshit about it. So now she's writing another book. And I said, hang on, Daria, what you've got here is an incredible model of development, really amazing. You think this book is good? Wait till you see her book on development. It's 100 times better than any model of development that's out there. We reviewed them all. They're lacking. And so she's like, if you've got trauma at this stage, these things can happen. So that's kind of like a developmental defense mechanism, if you like. And like me, I'm avoidant. And so sometimes there's emails I'll need to answer and they're very urgent and I won't look at them for 2 weeks, something like that, because I know I get anxious and I just can't even open the email, you know. And so it's kind of a coping mechanism, I guess. But it is something when I look back at it, I thought I did more with it than it's actually in the model and in the book. And it's something I would, if I, well, I'm going to do another book follow up on interoception because that is just unbelievably important. And I have got a section on in it in there, but I had to really, you know, at one point I had a 50-page appendix on interoception in this. I'm like, oh, it's too much. I took it out. I'm going, book two. But it's changing all my kinesiology courses too, because, you know, for example, if insulin, for example, you release insulin when you eat glucose, right? So the interoceptive message of insulin is I'm hungry, I need to eat, I need food, you know. And glucagon is I've had enough to eat. So then you can challenge that and you can say if insulin comes up, you can say I've had enough to eat, or I'm hungry, or something like this. And if that has a stress, because that's the interoceptive message of it, your brain will detect it with the neurology through to the insular and then to the anterior cingulate gyrus. And then from there, you've got the neuroemotional pathway or the affective circuitry, as Panksepp calls it, down through the amygdala and PAG, and then you get the response in the muscles. So that's really important. And I've just been going over all my hormone courses and adding all this in. It's just like crazy, but yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I ended up reading a lot about interoception and the way it works with the insula in my Guardian class because we're talking about fascia. And just
Yeah,
the fact that I think people don't necessarily realize that that interoceptive data is not taken into the sensory cortex. It's taken into part of your brain that figures out who you are and all of
yeah,
the
yeah.
different next to, right?
Well, the insula is actually a very ancient part of the cortex. I mean, if you look at, say, in Brodmann's there's a book by Brodmann out there. He drew the maps of all the different brains from like a mouse or something up to the human like this. And very early developmental of mammalian brains has a full insula in there. And so it's a very ancient part of the brain.
Okay, so I'm curious. I'm going to unpin my video here, and if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask about this, now might be the right time.
I have a question. What I've heard, learned, or whatever is the amygdala communicates to the NTS and the NTS communicates to the vagus nerve. Now, how does that fit in with what you've presented?
Okay, so the vagus nerve. So you've got the nucleus of the solitary tract is the sensory information coming in from the organs and glands comes in through the vagus nerve, comes into the nucleus of the solitary tract. So that has sensory information. The vagus nerve, you've got the dorsal vagus nerve, and then you've got so that's afferent into the nervous system. Efferent, you've got the dorsal vagus and you've got the nucleus ambiguous. The dorsal vagus is the unmyelinated and nucleus ambiguous is the myelinated. And so they go out and they do, you know, they provide vagal stimulation to all the organs and glands and muscles and particularly with the unmyelinated vagus to the heart. So it's very important for the heart rate, where the myelinated, and this is polyvagal theory, the myelinated vagus nerve, unmyelinated, it's like it's reptilian and it slows down your heart rate and you get a very low heart rate variability. And when you've got myelinated vagus nerve on the heart, you've got high heart rate variability. And so that's less stress. And so so with the nucleus of the solitary tract, some of the interoceptive information comes in through, there's different ways it comes in. It comes in through the vagus nerve. and that goes into the nucleus solitary tract. Also comes in through the spinal nerves, and they follow the sympathetic pathways, but it's not sympathetic because it's sensory, but it follows that same pathway and comes into the spinal cord, then goes up, and it goes up to the nucleus solitary tract, to the parabrachial nucleus, and then up to the amygdala. And then it can come down to the PAG, and then you can get a muscle response. Also, it can go up to the insula, and where you've got the interoceptive cortex. And from there, it can then send it to the anterior cingulate gyrus, which then will take it bed nucleus, amygdala, hypothalamus, PAG, and down, and again, muscle response. So that's all part of that pathway. And, you know, the interoception is quite important. And, you know, it's something, you know, it was a real wake up to me. And it doesn't stop at hormones either. The minerals are interoceptive messages, our vitamins. I mean, you can get interoceptive messages from so many different things. And the hormones, I was just updating my estrogen course, and that was interesting, putting all that in there. And even breast milk, for example, all the components of breast milk have interoceptive messages. And wow, that blew my mind, you know. I just did that. I just updated that last week. I just finished doing that one, and that was, I'm leaving hormone. I've got to finish this structure course. So I'm back on that now. The other important thing I'd like to mention is about allostasis. This was something that's kind of very interesting, because you'll notice in the book when I talked about, there's a section on transition thresholds. And so what happens when you have long-term stress, so you're in stage 2 for a long time, and you get high levels of stress hormones like, you know, cortisol, adrenaline, ACTH, corticotrophin hormone, and all this, that's called allostatic load. And so once you go into the third stage, like you're in like a trauma state, it actually it impedes you coming back down. When you transition back down, it's actually a lot harder because of the allostatic load and this allostasis. I think the guy's name was McEwen from memory. And so that was something really, really important. I'd never even considered it before, but then, you know, it's really an important thing to consider, because the stress, you need to clear those stress hormones. And this is why kinesiology is so amazing, because because of the way I've described the neurology of the muscle test, what you see is that by using muscle testing, you know, what the brilliance of it is that we can find the correction, what changes it back to that homeostatic state, and that's the correction. And that was George Goodhart. And, you know, in the new book, I go through the whole history of muscle testing from back in the 1850s, where it was first started in Sweden. And I thank Mac Willan. I went to my son's in Stockholm doing his PhD. I went to visit him, and I visited Mac Willantis. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He's a Swedish kinesiologist. He used to sponsor Richard, actually, back in the day. And he showed all this stuff to me, how someone found this buried in an archive, and they got kicked out of Sweden at the end of the 19th century. So earlier 20th century, they ended up in Boston. There was 2 schools. And then from there, it was picked up by physiotherapists, because early 20th century, they needed something for testing polio patients, and ended up with Kendall and Kendall. And then to George Goodhart, and he was the first person to actually correct a muscle test. And I remember in 2005, when John T's last conference, I went to it, and George Goodhart was there, and he gave a talk. And if you can get a copy of the video, it's fantastic. He goes through everything, and he started playing with the book, and he tested a muscle as weak, and then he palpated the muscle, and it tested strong. And so he was the first person to actually correct a muscle test. And that was the birth of applied kinesiology. And then, of course, he found meridians and then the Bennett and Chapman reflexes. And then John T took that, parts of it. He didn't take all of it, but parts of it he brought into Touch for Health with, which is all of our daddy in kinesiology. John T's our daddy or granddaddy or whatever.
I mean, one of the basic tenets of working with allostatic load is that as the allostatic load increases, we lose our adaptability, right? And that's one of the
Exactly.
things that you talk about so much in this
Yeah.
book is that you're
Yeah.
looking at some stages. It's not that there isn't stress, it's just is the body able to be flexible and adapt to stress?
Yeah.
And if we're adapting, it's great. But when we get locked in these patterns, we're not adapting anymore, right? We're stuck in
Yeah.
overcompensating patterns or under facilitated patterns.
That's right. And that's Darwin. The most adaptable survives. It's not the smartest, not the strongest. It's the most adaptable. That's what he said. But what's interesting with kinesiology about that is that when you're going through, a balance, we'll find second, third stage. It doesn't mean if third stage stress shows, it doesn't mean they're in exhaustion and they've got a huge allostatic load. It just means that moment of that issue or whatever you are in that point is causing this kind of exhaustion and collapse or defeat. I think the best word for that is defeat. I've been defeated. I've given up, you know. And by being able to de-stress that, and even with the thing is, but when people are in full trauma and in these long-term third stage of stress, they have this low heart rate variability, and so no adaptability, and you can measure it in that. Mm. Holly.
I'm just curious, and again, I'm kind of coming in poorly here, but when you're talking about that recovery process and these progressive stages of stress unfolding and activation in the nervous system, et cetera, when somebody's recovering, do you find that they move backwards through those stages, or is recovery a different process?
Yeah, it's got these things called the transition thresholds. I'll just look it up where that is. Oh yeah, it's chapter 4. You've got the different thresholds there. You've got the transition threshold. Stage 3 to 2 is called reactivation. Stage 2 to 1, disinhibition threshold. Stage 1 to 0, reintegration threshold. And so they're kind of interesting. I mean, the AI named those. I mean, I would have. And you can see that, um, and in there it describes what you see, like shifts in the PAG column and things like that. So yeah, that's in chapter 4 of the book. The thresholds, the recovery thresholds, I think they're called when you go down. Denise, you got your hand up?
I do, and I don't know if you'd be prepared to answer this question. I'm curious about the quality of touch on acupuncture points, and particularly like with AP, there's light touch, deep touch. You're affecting the meridian in different ways. But what about tapping? Why is it that systems like EFT that do tapping on points de-stresses the system? Do you have a mechanism? Do you have a knowledge of that mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, in the textbook, you said you just got it. There's an appendix on light touch and deep touch, where I actually go through the neurology of it and how it is actually different. Like you activate neurology different, and when you're tapping is a specific somatosensory stimulation. But we've found, like I know in EFT that that's Callahan originally. Everyone ripped him off, and where he came up with the tapping. And we did the endpoints of the meridians, and I was holding them in the naps, which is kind of so I've always preferred to hold points, and I like to feel them, and you can feel what we get, this feeling of like a shift of energy in the client, right? You've had that experience. It feels like there's this massive flow of awakening of energy within the client, right? Most of you would have experienced that. what that could actually be is the waking up of the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's what I think is actually happening. And so, yeah, so, the thing is holding points, tapping points, but whatever you're doing, light touch or deep touch, there is certainly a different neurology activated with it without question. Especially when you go deeper, you're actually activating the fascia. And the model of medical acupuncture, which is what they say acupuncture is a neurological technique and not a vitalistic technique, that is called medical acupuncture. They say it's through the fascia. So when you tap, you're going deeper, so that means you'll be activating the fascia.
Interesting perspective on that one.
Yeah, there's an appendix in the book. Have a look at it. Let's see what it is. There's appendix on mudras. Oh, yeah, appendix 7, light touch and deep touch. Epistemology and neurobiological substrate.
What page is that?
About 500. It starts on page 507. Appendix 7.
What book is that?
This one, the textbook,
Oh,
the one I just released, the 540-page monster. You know, Amazon only allow up to 550 pages for print on demand. I got to 540. I was just 10 pages inside the limit. I didn't have much room to add anything else. Someone said, why don't you add this? I go, I got no more room.
Okay, so then maybe I'll ask, since you brought up that book, how is this book different than, I was thinking, for instance, Charles's, energy kinesiology practices and principles book or something like that, where it's giving a bit of an explanation of all the things that we do and how muscle testing came to be and such. Why did you want to do this other textbook?
I don't know. Well, it started with, because I think there's something very unique in NK that I did with back over 20 years ago, is that I acknowledged that with under and over energy states, I started with chakras back in my very first long course I did in 2004. I introduced it there, that you've got a different emotion with under and over energy and whether it's yin or yang. And over the years, I've expanded that to meridians and 5 elements. And then recently, in the last couple of years, I just thought, oh, hang on, you've got to have the balance state as well. They're more behaviors than, say, emotions. And so I think, I've just done this such, and I added a few extra minor chakras, and I had all the celestial chakras, and such a big body of work, and it's all original. And so I thought, you know what, I should publish this, because I had people contacting me that had seen, like one woman who did energy medicine. She'd met in a course in the States, one of my Austrian students, and she saw my books and she goes, I want to learn with you. And I thought, you know what, I should make this publicly available now that, the way information is going with AI, it just becomes, there's no boundaries to it. And I thought, I need to just publish something about this. And so that was the start. And if you look back at my first draft, which was nothing like it is now, and even my second and third drafts, very different books each time. And so it just grew from, that was what I wanted to do. And then I had my own model of pause lock, different to Charles. I have got my own description of how muscle testing works, which no one had ever explained before. And then when Max showed me the history of this stuff in Sweden, I was able to, of course, using AI, it finds other things that little bits that he didn't have. And then I wanted to do, I've got a whole section on databases. I thought, well, I will do that. And then I started writing these appendices, which were kind of ways of almost challenging the kinesiology, there's even a chapter on mudras. Because, if you look at the somatosensory homunculus, the hands is one of the biggest parts of it, and we're using mudras. And so by holding hand positions actually creates a huge proprioceptive input into the brain. And so by saying all of these things, okay, we use mudras, but look at this. We use acupoints, but look at that, and this is muscle testing, but this is the neurology of it. That was the point. And it became bigger, and, I added things in and discovered things writing the book. I mean, I had to go back and change my Principles 1 and 2 manuals, but especially the Level 1 manual. I'd only updated it last year. I had to update it again this year. And so I had to change that because of the book. And so, yeah, that was the kind of the idea why I did it. And because, the thing is with Charles's book, it's got a lot of, there's quite a lot of content, but there's, and there's a lot of explanations of things, but there's I don't see what out of that book would you use actually with a client in a balance? Like Carrie's got one of my my third printer's proof, which is very close, and she's using it all the time in her balances, in the clinic. So this is a book you can use in your clinic. And this is, Charles wrote his ideas, this is my ideas, and probably later on some other dickhead will come along and have their own ideas, and I'm like, okay, whatever, I don't care. It's just, something I had to do. And, it's been, one thing people have kept telling me, I should have a book, and I've never been able to do it. And, but then it became time. Something just in me said, I have to write this textbook, something, I don't know. It was even the same way I even had a feeling I needed to study kinesiology. I had no idea why I wanted to do it, but I just knew I had to study it. And so, yeah, that's why.
Yes. All right. Are there any other questions? Crickets. All right. If there's no other questions, then is there anything else, Hugo, that you want to talk about in regards to this book, in the process?
Let me have a look. Let me have a look. Oh, yeah, one's kind of interesting, and I gave this talk, is about social engagement, because, Porges has his social engagement system in his polyvagal theory. I don't know how many of you know much about polyvagal theory, but that actually is about under stress, you seek comfort with your social connections, right? But what I wanted to do was, when I was looking through this, social engagement is about how you communicate with people, with, verbal communication, your vocalizer, how you vocalize, body language and things like this. And so I've always thought of social engagement, and even I remember quite a few years ago now, having a meeting with Alexandra and Daria about the social engagement system, and I gave my, I didn't understand what Porges meant then, and so I just gave my two bob. Well, it's about verbal and non-verbal communication and vocalization and everything like this, and so that is kind of an interesting, when you look through the 4 stages, how people vocalize, how they, how you're reading, and how you hear people and things like this. I think that's a very interesting thing, the social engagement, how we engage with people.
I did think the part about the voice was really interesting.
Yeah. I know. I wanted to add that in, and then I'm like, yes. But it's true, right? Mm-hmm. But what that can do means, if you understand this, when you're working with your clients and you see that, it helps you identify, you say, okay, the vocalizations are like this, that, so I think it's quite useful book for a kinesiologist, but clearly you need to have a good understanding of, it's certainly not an entry level first year university book, that's for sure. You have to have a good understanding of anatomy and physiology to be able to understand it.
I was thinking about the vocal part because I think as humans, we're quite good at noticing. We notice either consciously or subconsciously things about someone's voice, right? Like we can
Mm.
tell that someone is nervous, right? Or you can tell when someone is confident, and you can tell how someone sounds if they are relaxed. And to be able to then see it related so specifically to those stages of stress made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah,
All
sure.
right.
And that's survival mechanisms too, because if someone's stressed out, you automatically start going to this hypervigilance. Like hypervigilance is the first stage of stress. So you go into this hypervigilant state, and you start to ski. You can't look in one place at the one time. You're constantly scanning and looking around. And I do that when I get a bit stressed out, and then people get frustrated, go, look, you're being dismissive, or you're doing that. As no, I'm actually, what it is no, I'm in first stage of stress. I'm going, oh my God, I need to do this, I need to do that, And so then my vocalization changes. I try to cut the conversation. I want to do this. I can't engage properly because your engagement is scanning for threats, and not, so for people to properly engage, they need to be in zero. And so that gives it's a tool that helps kinesiologists understand their clients. And the better you can understand the clients, the better you can help them. And especially bringing it out from the subconscious and unconscious into the conscious. Like one of my teachers used to say, the power is making the unknown known. And so then, I've even got that triune model of consciousness, awareness. I think you named it something like this. It's something I've taught for a long time, but, being able, half the battle is really being able to understand what your issue is. And the thing is with kinesiology, because and this is why kinesiology is such an incredible tool. And this is all modalities I'm talking about. It's not just NK or SIPs or GEMS or whatever modality people are doing. Basically, what you're doing is that with muscle testing, because you can bring people into zero, even if it's just, when they go into that deep relaxed state, when you're balancing them and that experience, and they go into this really deep kind of relaxed state, and then they're in zero, that's that parasympathetic nervous system then has become dominant. The myelinated vagus nerve is dominant. They've got high heart rate variability. And then all of a sudden, and you might say something and it'll just, what I do is I also, could it be something around this? Or, I'll use one of their chakra emotions, like, so yin under energy in the throat chakra, you're not listening. What does that mean to you? Oh, yeah, I don't listen, and then all of a sudden something pop out of their subconscious or unconscious becomes conscious. Then you can really work with it and really help them resolve the issue. And how many times have any of you done that, no matter what modality you're using? Doesn't matter which modality, that's what it does. All kinesiologies do it.
Amazing. All right. Well, we're coming to the end of our hours. So, was there any other questions before we kind of wrap up this part of our conversation? Yeah, Mark.
Hugo, I was just wondering, you said you take a lot of time to write books. Do you still do session work with clients in your day-to-day world?
No. I actually, when I first graduated and I was living in Melbourne, and I actually had 2 clinics quite busy. And then my then partner, now ex-partner, our children were very young. They were like 1 and 3 or something. Her parents moved up to the far north coast, so she decided she wanted to move up there. And I agreed to it because I knew they would be amazing with the boys growing up. And but it's just something I've never really wanted to do. And, the most stressful part of me teaching a course is actually doing the demo. And that's the thing that stresses me out the most, especially when I be in a group of people and I go, oh my God, who's going to come up for the demo? And, and then people, some people come up and they say, oh, I just want to have a balance with you. And that's why I'm very particular when selecting the person. I always get them to explain me what their issue is and why it's suitable for what I'm demonstrating, But no, I don't do clients. My role is to develop. That's what I'm here for. That's what I've been doing for almost 30 years now. And, you know, and if people want a balance, I usually refer them to someone I've trained. But occasionally I do it. Like last year down here in the Australian ski fields, one of my mates did her ACL. And I was sitting with her husband. I ski with her husband a lot. We were sitting on a chairlift, and he was just so down because she just retired, and they're about to do a round Australia trip. And I said, okay, I'll balance her. Look, and the results were so stunning. I even met a ski journalist, and they wrote an article on it in Snowbrains. I don't know if you know snowbrains.com. There's an article on me and this, and so, but now it's led to a whole thing where I'm developing a sports program for sports, and we're thinking about doing an advanced diploma even, which we're going to talk about later, right, Alexis? Because I think if we're going to do this, SIPS should be a part of it for sure, because it's all structural, and the first three, SIPS 1 and 2 on BAT, and using SIPS and NK together is just the best, because formats reveal stress, SIPS diffuses stress. I mean, when I injured my ankle skiing and I was in Germany, and this is back in 2018, and Alfred goes to me, I'm going to balance your ankle. Okay. It's the only time he ever balanced me. And he was like doing my ankle balance, but diffusing, all the muscle formats with the SIPS muscle, all the ligaments with the SIPS, and using all, I was like, oh, it blew me away. And I mentioned it to Yolanda, who was both faculty for SIPS and NK. She goes, oh, yeah, that's what I do. And I thought, holy hell. They're just, and interestingly enough, Ian and I both were trained by Charles. So it's kind of from the same source even, So, no, I don't really do clients per se. It's not my thing. But I will do ACLs, because we're going to do an ACL project now. We got one stunning, and the woman who was going to do it with me in Austria, she's already got people lined up who want to do collaboration with us. So we want to actually collect some data and then publish it.
Like balance enough people's ACL that it's a valid study. That's the idea. Nice.
No. Well, I mean, you just look at her results. She went into second stage rehabilitation in 3 weeks instead of 6, right? She had, when she first came to me, like 8 days after the operation, like her knee was swollen, and then I did a balance, and then I did 3 balances over 6 days, and on the 6th day before I took another photo. The swelling and pain had all gone down, was completely gone. And when she went to the nurse couldn't believe it. She says, I've never seen it like this, right? And even the surgeon was amazed, when she went back to the surgeon. And by the time she got up to my place on the far north coast, it was about a week later, a month later, or 6 weeks later, she had a lot of stiffness in the knee. And so the kinesiology gets rid of the stiffness, and then she further went up Queensland. I organised 2 other people I've trained further north she went to, and then she was fine after, I think she had altogether 6 balances. And now it's 10 months later, the physio said her left knee, which she had the operation, has 100% strength of the right knee. So that's pretty amazing, pretty amazing recovery. I mean, only 6 balances. I gave her 1 balance maybe a month ago when she first, at the start of the season, but she didn't really need it. I mean, it was incredible to see how just the amount of recovery that she has.
All right. Well, we'll turn off the recording in a minute here. I want to thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us tonight and talking about your work, and for putting more kinesiology work into the world, because I love this work, and I love when we have ways of explaining it to people, like new ways of explaining it to people. So if anybody picks this up and finds us because of this, then that's amazing, right? So thank you so much.
Thank you. No worries.
Okay. So